Hey friends, and welcome to this week's episode of the U-Turn Podcast. This is your host, Ashley Stahl. I'm a counterterrorism professional turned career coach, speaker, and Forbes blogger, and I created the U-Turn Podcast because, let's face it, every now and again we realize that we're living life on autopilot and it's time to wake up and make that U-turn in your life. So prepare to go deep with some of the most transformational people I know, here to help you grow and upgrade your mindset, whether it's in work or love. Also, be sure to stick around for the end of every episode where I'm going to reflect on the conversation and offer actionable coaching insights to have a real impact on your life. In the meantime, we've opened up access to 3 free e-courses on uturnpodcast.com. So head on over there if you want to land a new job you love, find your purpose, or launch your dream business. All of these courses are totally free. All you got to do is head on over to uturnpodcast.com. That's YOUTURN podcast.com. Now let's get started with this week's guest.
A lot of my work is influenced by a body of work called psycho-cybernetics. If you're not familiar with it, it's absolutely incredible. It's about like self-image psychology, right? Essentially how like your identity, who you think you are, creates the parameters of your beliefs, which creates the parameters of what you're literally able to experience. You could actually even be experiencing something and not even realize it just because of where your beliefs are at, right? It might not even register, you might not even notice it. But if you just think like, oh yeah, I'm just a shy person, like people don't really seem to connect with me. That's context, right? That's a belief. You're like, that's just who I am. That's like a part of the plot of my life is I'm just that person people don't seem to connect with. So if you're sitting there believing that and that's who you are, someone will literally be trying to connect with you and you'll push them away.
Hello, friends. It's Ash Stahl, and of course, I'm here with another friend who really inspires me, Nathaniel Solace. He is a leadership and consciousness coach and the founder of Gamapreneur program. And the goal of this program is to help you fully embody who you are and what you're doing in the world. And I thought that the best topic we could dive into today is how to take inspired action. Nathaniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so freaking pumped to be here.
Pumped because we haven't hung out in so long that at least we get to do a podcast episode.
Yeah, totally. Let's go for it.
Yeah, and also those of you who are listening, I see Nathaniel as just a very embodied person, and whenever I'm around him, I feel a sense of relief. So my guess is that as you're listening to this conversation, you're listening to him, you're just going to feel some sort of relief in your life. So if you're feeling tense right now, by the end of this, I'm guessing you won't. But before we dive in, Nathaniel, can you tell everybody, like, how did you get to this place of awesomeness?
Well, first, I just want to say, that just landed for me, too. Like, to associate me with relief is really meaningful. So just thanks for saying that and, telling that to your audience. Because that's totally possible. Everyone could totally, chill out right now. Regardless of anything I say, if you want to chill out, go for it.
You're already doing it, already providing the relief.
But as far as being so awesome, it's at one point it's the result of the choice, because it's like, oh my gosh, that's an option. I can be really awesome and try to be a really happy, healthy, successful version of myself. Why not, right? And I feel really lucky that that's even an option for me. But I would say, and the more I talk to people about it too, at a pretty young age, I became aware of quite a handful of things and the right combination of things, from conspiracy theories to what death is like in a family to, messing around with the system in all sorts of ways. And it just led me to this higher perspective where I realized everyone's kind of living in this bubble of things we think are real, and they're not necessarily that real. Even just the town that I grew up in, right? There's people still living there now who have worked at the same restaurant for the last 10 years, and that's okay, but they've literally never left the town. And it's like, wait a minute, there's so many options of what the human experience can look like. So I went for the full lucid option, where it's I want to know everything about everything. And this stemmed from my experience from 8 years old, that I've been lucid dreaming since I was 8 years old. So I've always had this sort of extra option of awareness. So I applied that to my waking life. How do I wake up from what I might be asleep to? And it just got me obsessed with researching things. And when I was 18, me and my friends built a website where we tried to gather literally all the most educational videos on the internet and put them on one website and write little reviews about all of them and basically create this sort of like consciousness evolving like red pill of a website, I guess, essentially. And then I started a YouTube channel and just started sharing myself. And it's been almost 10 years now that I've been like online creating content and educating people and creating events and all these different kinds of things. And it's also led to me kind of being like a scientist in my own way too, and being really obsessed with like human behavior and how do we take care of all the problems on the planet for everybody, and how do we do that like as efficiently and graciously as possible and have as much fun along the way.
Yeah,
so
and you
that's what I'm all about.
Well, and just listening to you, you feel so centered, and whenever you walk into the room, that's what I feel. And by the way, the reason I explain that you feel like relief is because I went to a party the other day and they handed out a piece of paper. It was at Layla Martin's. And she asked everybody, how do you want people to feel when you leave the room because of you? And I wanted to feel like a healing presence. That's what I want to feel like. And maybe like a lightener, like making things lighter. And I feel like you feel like relief. That's what I give you. I'm not sure if that's what you're going for, but just listening to you speak now, it seems like, yeah, you were very curious and you're pretty tapped having these lucid dreams from a young age. And I would love to hear, what does that even mean?
So, So it's interesting, like learning what everyone's perspective on all of that. So lucid dreaming really simply is just when you're asleep and you're dreaming, but you become like, you're dreaming while you're in the dream.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Not everyone's even had that experience. A lot of people do. But there's different layers of it, too, because sometimes you can just be in there and kind of have this sense of knowing you're safe. Right. Like you're like, oh, this isn't like real life. Like you kind of have this tingling sense of it. And then there's layers of lucidity where you're fully aware you're dreaming and you're thinking thoughts like, wait, I just went to sleep. Like, what's going on? I'm laying in my bed right now, but I'm having this experience, and I can even like look around and decide like who I want to talk to, or then even where I want to walk to. And then you start to literally be able to like create worlds and universes and have like God powers. Like the more it's literally like a movie where like the more willpower in a sense, or the more like and surrender and trust that you have, you can literally create like universal superpowers. And I've gotten to that level, and it's totally blows me away. But it's like a built-in video game that I think all humans have access to.
It's like a spiritual gamer.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
And just what do you think it's about when somebody is in a lucid dream? What do you think is available there? What's the gift?
Well, so I think it's the fact that it's literally pretty much like a third of our entire life means, and it's built in, like it's a default, automatic, non-negotiable, have to sort of thing. We have to sleep every night. It doesn't mean you dream every night or have to, but the fact that that's such an intimate part of our life just already makes me think it's probably pretty important. Right. And then the fact that it can be some of the most emotional experiences of our life is also seems really important. And then the fact that it's just such a playground to explore your own consciousness and like, what do I do when I can do anything? Which is really trippy. I was just telling someone the other day how like I've killed someone before. I've killed lots of people before in my dreams.
Wow.
Just to make sure that's clear. And it's so trippy because it's like in a dream I'm having in like a war scene or some like crazy movie playing out, and that just ends up being like what's written into that, script. And then that's interesting because now that I'm awake, I have the memory of me having that experience. Right. And you can't prove to me at this point that something I did yesterday is any different than a dream I had last night, because now they're just memories in my brain. Right. They're the same thing. It's something that I did in the past. Right. To me, they're just as real now because they're both just memories of something I vividly experienced emotionally and even physically, too. Like some people, everyone's experience of dreams are different. Some people can't hear sound. Some people don't see color. Some people don't feel any physical sensation. Like I've been eaten alive by a shark in a dream, and I could feel all of it. I mean, at least to what I imagine. It was, pain beyond all ideas of pain.
Wow.
And all kinds of other experiences like that. So I think it's honestly like this built-in, it's almost like an inner diary where you get to explore these different symbols and archetypes of your unconscious. Like we have all these built-in parts of the human experience whether you find it from astrology or from psychology or whatever, where it's like your relationship with authority figures, your relationship with the opposite sex, with the same sex, your relationship with power, your relationship with sexuality, all these different things. That's the stuff. If you look at every dream you ever have, there's these, symbols built in. And I've also found you can use dreams as an opportunity to literally like integrate and almost, and in a sense, like practice life experiences while you're awake, right? You have that argument the night before in your dream, and you get to really like sort some things out and actually consider some things. And then you step into that conversation the next day, and it doesn't have to be an argument.
So interesting.
Because you have this more awareness around it.
And when it comes to taking inspired action, you are someone who's had different waves in business. You've gone through a lot. And I'm so curious, what got you to this place where you feel like you can be so fully embodied? Because we live in a world right now where there are so many teachers out there that are not walking the walk. They're talking the talk. And I really see you as integrated. I see you talking and I see you walking. So what do you think got you to this place of awareness and ability?
At first it was, and thank you. Wow, that's just so cool to hear you say that. I really appreciate that. That's like such a huge compliment, honestly, just to be integrated.
I mean, we're friends, Nathaniel. I think you're pretty fucking awesome human.
Yeah, thank you. At first I was one of those just talkers, with a big heart, and you can feel it. The heart was there and the talk game was strong and that can get you certain results, and that can build certain things, and that was great. And then I built something that was hollow from that. And to put that in another way, it's basically like I was developing my mind and my like skill of cleverness and figuring it outness and creativity too, and all these other things. But there was no emphasis on my body or on my emotions or on my relationships, really. It just wasn't really prioritized. So part of that too, that path of like stepping into embodiment and like really trusting, because I think the reason we don't take inspired action is because there's a lack of trust there, right? When you have like full certainty about something, that's just what you have, right? That's just what's there. So if you don't have full certainty of what's on the other side of taking any kind of action, especially inspired action, that's when we're going to have a hard time. And what I realize is that the thing we're not afraid of like the potential scary outcome on the other side of taking action. We're afraid of how unsafe we feel in our own body in that outcome, right? It's like our inability to handle our own emotional state in the future when we mess up. That's what we're afraid of. Because even when you mess up, nothing's actually a problem other than your state of being and how you're feeling. And we can only take that so much. It's like we're putting ourselves in these stressful situations over and over and over again, trying to like come up with a better and better scenario instead of solving the core issue, which is like the actual state of our nervous system on the default level. And how can we raise the baseline of that default so we're like naturally available to like handle more and have that capacity for all the little failures that make big successes. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And, when we were, and everybody listening, you know how I am before I start recording, I'm always talking. So we talked about pattern interrupts. And I find this really interesting. I know that as a writer who's written a lot of different materials, and those of you listening, you know how Cake Publishing, it's a ghostwriting house. So I have ghostwriters writing blog posts, but I also have copywriters writing copy. And one of the most fundamental tools in copywriting is a pattern interrupt. And so copywriting is anything from websites to shopping carts, anything that the goal is a sale. And pattern interrupts are ways to wake up the person reading and make sure that they're paying attention. So I'm so curious, Nathaniel, I haven't seen somebody talk about a pattern interrupt in a hot minute. So what does this have to do with everybody who is thinking about trying to take inspired action?
Yeah, so often we're trying to like take inspired action, consider what it might be, right? Plan for it, and try to build from a place where we're already running in these certain patterns or habits, whether that's habits in your environment, habits of how you use your time, habits of how you use your energy, even what you're eating, things like that. Something as simple as like intermittent fasting for one, morning, right? Just not eating until 1 p.m. one day. That's a whole interrupt for somebody's system usually. And for a lot of people, that can be a really valuable one, right? Something as simple as realizing you're sitting there stressing out about the next step to take, sitting on your couch in that same place you always sit, looking at your phone, holding it in that shitty posture that you always hold it in. And if just for once you actually stood up, put the phone down, and went outside and went for a walk for 10 minutes, that could change your whole life, right? And if we're not willing to assume that there's more information outside of the pattern we're in, then we keep relying on the pattern we're in, which is a finite resource.
Yes.
Right? Because it can only build so much, and it becomes this self-enabling feedback loop of familiarity, which puts us in our comfort zone and keeps us there. Right.
This is fascinating because I think that it could be tough for somebody to figure out like what is a good pattern interrupt for me. So in my case, the other day I started hiking in the Hollywood Hills, and that was so random for me, but it was so great. And it did a lot for me. So what do you think was happening to me as I made that pattern interrupt? So let's say somebody listening now goes and does a different exercise, goes and does a walk, sees a different type of friend that day, takes a cooking class, like whatever pattern interrupt it is. Can you give some examples of what they are and what was happening to me when I went on that hike? What is that doing for me?
Yeah, totally. I think a great way to look at it is, and Tim Ferriss says something along the lines of like, what would happen if I ran an experiment where I just did the exact opposite for 48 hours, right? And it's like, what could I really lose? So if you look at like when you're waking up, if your waking up is usually based around a sleeping in sort of vibe, just what would happen if you set an alarm, got up at 5 a.m. for 2 days in a row, just to see what happens? And what that does, the analogy that came to mind when you asked was like, if you're playing Jenga, because I'm thinking about playing like Jenga with Libby and Scott and all them. And it's like, when you're looking at the tower from one perspective, there's only so many moves you can see are possible. But if you like, do a 90-degree turn and look from another angle, you see it from another perspective. So you just have more options. So you going on that hike, instead of staying in the whatever your normal routine is, you're literally giving your brain a different environment and a different context to think about the thing you were probably, going to think about anyways. Right. But it's like giving you literally just a new lens to look at it with. And I think for most people, really what we're desiring all the time is just more clarity. And then you look at the definition of insanity, right, which is like doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So it's like, if you just put two and two together, it's like, oh, then I have to do something different, right? Even if it's just one thing. And I encourage people to just literally start as simple as you possibly can. I realized when I was younger, I was obsessed with, I would rearrange my room probably a couple times a year, which I think is more than most people.
Yeah.
But I just thought it was fun. And I love the idea of like, ooh, now I get to sit at my desk like this, and I can look, and then the window's over here now. And that just was fascinating to me. And it kept me in more of a creative flow too, because I'm switching things up.
Yeah, I did that. As a kid, I used to always beg my mom for new bedding. Like I felt like a new bedding would just change my whole room in my head.
Yeah.
I
think part of the value of the pattern interrupt too is like training yourself to realize it's okay to like do novel things. Because sometimes, let's say you want to start your own business, and now it's time to do all kinds of novel things. One of those things being like sales conversations. And it's like, if you haven't built up the embodiment of realizing you're safe doing new things that are uncomfortable, then doing something like that, which you have to do to grow a business, like that's a big deal, right? You can't let something like that trip you up. So it's like, this is an opportunity. Same reason why things like cold exposure, taking cold showers, right? Or even just working out, especially if you don't like working out, or going on runs because you don't like going on runs. It's like you're training yourself to realize there's reward on the other side of uncomfortable action.
Oh, I love that. And just providing a new environment for potentially new creativity on the same topic.
And it's like, might as well spice up your life. Have a little bit more interesting things to do,
All the boys and all the girls, spice up your life. Oh.
That's exactly what I just thought of.
Oh my God, what a blast from the past.
That's good.
And as far as taking inspired action, you also mentioned, and I thought this was interesting, that number 2, after you look at a pattern interrupt and you offer that to yourself, catching up and completing things. And that felt loaded to me. I was like, whoa, we have so many things.
And that's because it's that needed, right? Like, so the pattern interrupt gives you this little hit of like dopamine and some hormones and stuff where you're like, ooh, new energy. Like, ooh, I'm a bit more motivated. I'm a bit more excited, which for a lot of people, the next step for most people is to like put the dishes away, right? And vacuum the floor in your car, which you haven't done in a year and a half, right? These random little things where our unconscious mind is tracking all of them. It remembers that pile of clothes in the bottom of the closet that really are harmless sitting there, but you don't actually want them there. So you're like, 0.01% of you is thinking about that until it's done, right? And I don't know if this is exactly true, but it's more of like this analogy to live by. And I have 100% proof of this in my own experience and everyone I introduce this concept to. But it's like the moment your kitchen is clean, you all of a sudden have more bandwidth. Right. And for a lot of people, like when your bed's made and your room's vacuumed and the desk looks tidy, like you just have more bandwidth. And I think a lot of that, too, just has to do with, again, coming back to symbols and the unconscious mind, this context that we're in. Right. And you'll notice sometimes when you're overwhelmed and busy and a little stressed out, your house gets a little bit messier. Right. And usually we go, oh, yeah, because I'm so busy and focused on all these things. I don't have the bandwidth for all that. When, from my experience, when you create the bandwidth to take care of all that first or prioritize that, you actually have more bandwidth available for the thing you want to put all your energy into. And like, so actually flipping those is a big deal. And there's a lot of people, and it gets so tricky trying to just like work on our lives and do the next thing and create all this stuff. And then there's that, garage sale you've been wanting to do for 7 years. It's like doing that and just literally moving energy, getting rid of things, cleaning things up. All of that stuff is so massive for people. And anyone I introduce that to always comes back and is like, holy shit, like I cleaned out my closet or I did something. And I feel more caught up. And then tying that back to something a little deeper too, a particular definition of trauma, which for a lot of people is like the source of that sort of invisible pattern, right? That alters our behaviors and keeps getting us stuck in things. But that trauma is ultimately just an incomplete experience, right? Like something you went through in the past that altered you emotionally, physically, it was super intense, and there wasn't a sense of integration with that. It didn't create you don't complete it. And that's why, let's say, after a breakup, you can't even talk about it for months, right? Because it's not integrated yet. It's still painful. It still affects your behaviors reactively. But then maybe a year later, you can talk about it and actually feel grateful for it, right? And be fond of it. That means it's integrated. That means you've completed that experience. And not to say that we have to land at like gratitude and fondness for everything. And I like the idea of moving forward in my life, knowing that like I'm not having my past come in and steer the ship. Right, when it doesn't need to, when it doesn't need to be in charge.
Well, and when you say catch up and complete things, that could mean so many things. So it could mean cleaning out your closet. Oh my gosh, you're bringing me back to all the 90s jams. We got Eminem, we got Spice Girls, cleaning out my closet. Okay, so people could do that. But what else, when you said completing things, you'd mentioned relationships, breakups, heartbreaks, traumas. Mm-hmm. Those things, who knows how long they could take, right? Like,
yeah.
And so I'm curious, what are some recommendations you have for people to figure out, number one, what is pulling on their energy? What do they need to be completing that maybe they're not aware of? Because it's kind of sneaky. And secondly, how to go about that.
Yeah, so one exercise that I do that definitely covers a lot of the bases is to literally just go through every year of your life, get out a piece of paper, write down the year, and just feel into what's the name of that chapter of your life? What did you go through? Do you remember when you were 4 and there was a birthday present you got and it was really cool? Awesome. Write it down. All right. Do you remember you were 6 and you had your first crush in kindergarten and they punched you in the nose? I don't know. And remember that. So like literally just seeing what's available to come up for a lot of people will remind them of things like, oh yeah, there's that thing when I was 13 that I don't, I almost never think about that, but that comes up in this exercise. And if it has that charge around it, that's how you know it's incomplete and it's not integrated, right? And those are those little things, as we all know, it's like we get programmed at such a young age, basically from 0 to 8, you're like this total sponge. And if you don't go back and look at that stuff, you're running a lot of programs that are still in there from such a long time ago. So just to literally audit your life and see where the emotional charges are, as confronting and intimidating as that can be, there's that phrase, the only way out is through, right? So knowing that the truth is safe. And if these are just the things that happened to you and the things that you went through, then that's just what they are. And here you are now. And we're moving forward from here, but it's important that we don't bring all of that with us in a way that's, not helping us.
And when you say complete things, And you talk about emotional charge. I think maybe everybody listening, maybe they don't know what that looks like for them. So how do you explain, let's say somebody's doing their list, they're doing age 1 to present, whatever age it is, and every year they write down something that they remember, maybe something traumatic, maybe something that is just a memory they have. How do they figure out what is emotionally charged?
I think the simple answer to that is that it in my experience, and most people I know, you'll have a sort of almost binary gut response, like, ooh, there's something there, or there isn't. And it'll probably feel more like tension and tightening and flexing versus like opening and relaxing, right? Like when you're stressed, you get tense, right? So if you have this unintegrated experience that's still holding even the subtlest stress in your body, you'll notice, your breath getting short. You'll notice maybe you start heating up. You'll notice your mind starts racing around that thing and retelling that story and diving into all of that. And you get in this sort of reactive sense that we're all so familiar with, that's a pretty telltale sign. If you just feel that sense of like, wow, this seems to either trigger me or like bring up stuff in me. And then the key to actually completing it, put really simply, and of course, like, this is, goes without saying, like, there are so many incredible professionals out there that can support with these kinds of things specifically. And I think this is the kinds of skills humans should just be taught in general. But the key really with all of it is to just not judge the fact that you have any reactions to it. It's a natural thing to have these, emotions in our body, and then to let yourself actually feel it. Like often it's literally like we just don't complete like the 100%. We don't meet that quota for that emotion. And sometimes it's because we have a judgment about what it looks like. Like I've been telling some clients recently, you can associate the amount of snot that comes out of somebody's face with how much they're transforming in their life, right? When you have those true, like deeply emotional, like really feeling it, where it's snot down your nose and everything coming out, like those are the moments where you really change, where things really land, right? Because you're actually engaged in your body, you're actually engaged in that emotional experience, and it almost like takes over you. And so I think we're just our culture has created us so far removed from our emotional nature. We're just supposed to toughen up and hold it together and don't cry and all these kinds of things. And yet that's what we're all like literally inclined to do. So a lot of the completing thing is a very literal, like just finish feeling that thing. It's okay to go all the way. Obviously, like be smart, create a safe container. If you want to punch your pillow, go for it. If you want to, drive somewhere, park and scream in your car, go for it. All of like that is real therapy, because there's a lot of people with experiences they've had in their life and setbacks and failures and self-judgments, which is really most of it is guilt and shame and these self-judgments and stories that we create, when really we just want to like be able to like, oh my God, I had that experience and this is how much it sucked and I got to feel it all the way.
Well, and this feels kind of like an enigma for people, because I think some people who are listening, you and I work in personal development. And so when people say feel your feelings, we have some tools and strategies that come up. So let's say somebody's going down their list and they remember at age 14 that year that their best friend didn't come to their birthday party and how devastated they were. Mm-hmm. What would be some ways, modalities, exercises they could do to feel their feelings, to complete it?
Yeah. So working with others, this is where this gets helpful, to be like guided through things. And I would definitely recommend getting good at Googling and YouTube, like searching guided meditations and guided inner child healing and guided emotional healing meditation. There's so many things out there, and it's really fun to like experiment and find people that you really like. But in that scenario that you gave, sometimes really literal and often kind of like comical symbols work really well. Like I would recommend putting on the "It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want To" song, and like throwing a tantrum around your room with that song on, because it's going to do one of two things. It'll probably like just get you really pissed, because you're like, oh my God, because you'll just get pissed about your life in general, because you're like acting that out, and it'll make you think about all the other things that you're pissed off about, which is great. Get pissed, like feel that, so you can like get clear on that. Or it also just might make you start laughing so hard that you literally like laugh that experience out of your body by integrating the fact that you're so clear on the truth of it, which is that it has no power over you now. Right. And you can make a new decision about it, and you can define that decision differently. Right. Really what all this stuff comes down to is belief systems and these stories we're telling about our life, right? There's our life as it's actually happening, and then there's the story we have about it. And the story we have about it is the thing that we're feeling all the time. And I think all of this personal development work is really like unplugging yourself from the matrix, if that's the analogy, or like taking the wall off your eyes and realizing like you're living in, for pretty much the most part, you're living in a story you created for yourself. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing either. But when it comes to like trying to fix things and improve things in your life, that's where, like this sense of self-responsibility and diving in and really being your own author, it starts to get really real. And it's exciting too, because like all the tools to do that do exist. And the fact that someone like you exists and has a podcast like this, it's like you're one example of a whole like, transformation of consciousness on this planet that's happening, and people waking up to the fact that it's like, oh my gosh, it's okay to like really go for it. It's okay to try to be the best version of me. And there's a lot of resources to do it. So I'm just getting pumped. I'm getting excited.
Yeah,
if you can't tell.
And you know what is really fascinating and kind of off the beaten path for those of you who are listening. And I know that we're in a time of society right now, and you can take the girl out of politics, but you can't take the politics out of me, I guess, because what I'm thinking about right now is the Me Too movement and how we are in an era where so many women are finding out that there is a safe place for them, or that this society is becoming a safer place to admit to sexual harassment or abuse. I know that 1 out of 3 was what I last read. 1 out of 3 women have been sexually harassed on some level. I'm sure the number is much higher than that, because I haven't really met a woman who hasn't been sexually harassed in some level, depending on how they define it. But what I also know is that a lot of women have gone through molestation or something that was sexually off color for them at a young age, and it created, whether it's shame or confusion or disconnect with their bodies. And I promise this relates to you, Nathaniel, because what you're saying is to complete things. And a lot of you, especially you ladies listening right now, but this applies to, guys too, is I have read multiple times in personal development that if you have sexual trauma and you have a sexual partner, the way to complete it, or the way to allow yourself to feel it and let it go, is to actually act it out with your partner. But yeah, so I think that's really fascinating, because you have a safe person, your partner that you've chosen, and you have an experience that didn't feel safe that you're acting out. And so that's also a way for those of you listening who have any sexual trauma to consider completing that, because I know that is something that permeates your essence, it permeates your being, it permeates your body, the way you hold yourself. So just had to add that in. And pattern interrupt. Write a list of everything you've ever done so that you can catch up and complete things, or, any trauma you've ever had throughout the years of your life, or just memories. And then the third thing you said, Nathaniel, was a context audit. What does this mean?
So since our whole life is this like kind of illusory reality created of all these stories, some of which aren't true and some of which are, right? Like someone's walking around with a story of like, I'm not tall enough. Right? No, the woman of my dreams would never like me. I'm not tall enough. And then the actual woman of his dreams thinks he's the perfect height. Right? So he's walking around his whole life with this story. It's just not true. So he's in a certain context. A context that's the I'm too tall, I'll never get the girl of my dreams context. And it becomes this filter, and no matter what he looks at, it becomes this confirmation bias, and he just keeps reinforcing that story. Right. And he could even be introduced to a girl who totally has a crush on him, and they're the right height and it all works out. And because he's so committed to that belief in that story, he creates a scenario that's not even true that ends up with them breaking up. Right. And then reinforcing that story. Does that make sense? I think everyone has a lot of examples of that, but sometimes it's unconscious. So to actually go and start to ask questions like, what does it mean, relevant to what you're saying? Like, what does it mean to me to be alive as a woman right now, or to be alive as a man right now? Like, actually stopping asking that question. What does it mean to me to be an entrepreneur? What does it mean to me to have the things that I have, to be up to what I'm up to know the people that I know, right? These are all questions that invite you to explore your context, because we're walking around with all of these like millions of these little beliefs, this like substrate of like, who we are by default is made up of all these little stories of a lot of questions that we never even ask ourselves. Like, what does it mean to me that I shop where I shop, or I live where I live, or that I'm alive now versus being alive 50 years ago? What does it mean about my potential? What does it mean about what I'm here to do? And it really just starts to give you these questions to actually answer. And if you answer them for yourself, you start to realize there's a lot of room to inject some really powerful beliefs and really empowering beliefs, right? Because you could walk around and think, oh, because I was born in this specific place, that just means this default thing that it means about me, and that puts a cap on my potential. And then time and time again, there's examples of people who tell a new story and say, oh, because I was born in this type of place, I'm going to be that person who is the exception to the rule. Right? Like they wrote a new story and developed new context and actually used the same circumstances as fuel for the change, instead of those circumstances being the excuse.
Got it. And what's so interesting to me is I heard a few elements here with the context audit. The first element I heard was taking a look at the evidence, because a lot of the times we say that something's not going to happen, or that we're not something, or we don't have enough of something. And then when you take a look at the evidence, you look at your context, you realize, oh, I'm lying to myself. So anybody who's listening right now, you can think, and ask your friends if you don't know, have they heard you saying that this, talking about or complaining about something that isn't working for you? And so ask your friends, like, what am I complaining about? What do you hear me complaining about when I'm venting to you? And then ask yourself, is this true? Is there evidence in my life to prove this? Okay, cool. Also ask yourself, is there evidence to prove the opposite? Because usually there is, and your ego is just shopping to prove the same old story that keeps you small, so that you don't have to take action, you don't have to be vulnerable, or whatever the things are that you don't want to do. I totally get it. But I also heard you talk about our identity and our image, Nathaniel, which I think is really fascinating. And I had a mentor once who kind of talked about it like as if we're all one big Mr. Potato Head, where we have these little pieces that we put on. Like for me, part of my Mr. Potato Head, or Mrs. Potato Head, Miss, I guess, single right now, so Miss Potato Head is, I like rap music. I love cupcakes. I have funny dance moves. You know my Mrs. Potato Head. And so I think anybody listening, there's an opportunity right now to take a look at your image. What is your Mr. or Mrs. Potato Head? What are the pieces of you that you like people to see, that you like to see, that make you feel good about you? Is it that part of your Mrs. Potato Head is she gets her nails done every week? She's a member of the most exclusive gym. Like, how do you identify yourself? What is the image you're projecting? And Nathaniel, I'd love your thoughts on like all these random streams of consciousness that I'm giving right now, because I think it relates to the context audit.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's like the potato head analogy is just like how we're essentially not a blank slate, but we're just so editable or programmable. Like we can really design who we are. Because if you just look at who you are now, it's literally just the result of your past experiences. And your experiences today will be the past experiences of tomorrow, right? So it leads me to this question of like, so how do I live a lifestyle and be up to things in the world where I'm like enjoying my life today and making progress today and setting myself up to be even better at all that tomorrow?
I love this.
And I think the core of that potato head too is the identity piece. A lot of my work is influenced by a body of work called psycho-cybernetics. If you're not familiar with it, it's absolutely incredible.
Do tell.
And it's about like self-image psychology, right? Essentially how like your identity, who you think you are, creates the parameters of your beliefs, which creates the parameters of what you're literally able to experience. You could actually even be experiencing something and not even realize it just because of where your beliefs are at, right? It might not even register. You might not even notice it. But if you just think like, oh yeah, I'm just a shy person. Like people don't really seem to connect with me. That's context, right? That's a belief. You're like, that's just who I am. That's like a part of the plot of my life is I'm just that person people don't seem to connect with. So if you're sitting there believing that and that's who you are, someone will literally be trying to connect with you and you'll push them away. Because we're trying to reinforce our identity. Another analogy is like I've heard is like it's a thermostat. So if your identity, like your boldness or your magnetism or your ability to build rapport, like you have all these beliefs about where you're at, what your cap is, what's possible for you. So you set that, and let's say you set it at 70 degrees, right? And then you end up in a scenario where the temperature starts to go up and you start to step into more opportunity and more things. You're going to sabotage that to bring yourself back to where the thermostat is set, 7 degrees, because that's who you feel comfortable being, right? It's who you feel familiar as. And that's why every time we truly do make change, we can like fight it so much sometimes too, because it feels like some part of us is dying, because on that identity level, like who we thought we were actually is dying, because it's not going to exist anymore. I mean, or it's really just getting upgraded in a sense, or transmuted into something greater. But the identity piece is huge, because I start to realize, like, you know, in my scenario, I was adopted, and my mother passed away, and my brother passed away, and I was the black sheep in the family. I ran away from home, right? Like, was like literally like broke entrepreneur trying to do all this shit. And then for about 2 or 3 years, I kept sucking at everything, but only because I was continuing that story of being that kid who went through all that shit and has to struggle now because of where I was at. Right. And then I changed the context that I was in, and also start to realize how all those things that happened to me are actually like assets and have all contributed to my life in extremely massive ways. And then I'm able to have a new story about all of that. And it changes who I think I am. I don't think I'm this whatever, like broken person. I literally think like I picked the best like video game settings ever, and here I am playing.
Hey U-Turners, so sorry for the quick interruption, but I want to make sure you know that this episode has been brought to you by the Job Offer Academy, our e-course to help you land a new job you love. So if you're sick of applying for jobs and never hearing back, and you'd like to try a free version of our job hunting course, just head on over to youturnpodcast.com/job offer. That's youturnpodcast.com/job offer. Now let's get back to this week's episode.
You know, this is so funny because it reminds me of a mentor I once had, and his big thing he taught me was about self-fulfilling prophecies, which is a lot of what you're talking about with your image and how you believe you're one way, so you create more of it. And if you don't do a context audit, you might not realize there's a mismatch in evidence of what you think you are and what is. Yeah. And so really powerful. And it reminds me a lot of this mentor who, when I started my private coaching business, you know, like 5, 6, however many years ago, he said, Ashley, needy is creepy. And I was like, okay, good to know. And he gave me a whole analogy that I always remembered. He said, when you're needy, let's say there's somebody that wants to be around you, but they feel that you really want them. And this has happened before. Like, you know, when you're at a party and you're with your friends and maybe there's a new friend and they're kind of needy, like they want more of you, and it feels really suffocating. So what happens is that when people are needy, they hold on tighter. And I found this with like small animals in my particular case, like kittens. Yeah. Like I just fucking love little kittens, you know? So I'll walk into the room, and it's so funny because on one side of the room, you'll have my friend that's like, come here, little kitties. And they slowly walk over to her. You have me, and I'm like, you're so cute. And I like run over to the kittens, and they run away. And it's like, hello, needy is creepy. So perhaps somebody has a story that nobody wants to hang out with them, or maybe that, you know, something sucks about dating, when really they're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because
it's kind of like, if you think about after you watch a scary movie, that for the rest of the night, everything's a little scary.
Yes.
Right? Like you're a little creeped out. So the reason that happens is because when you watch a movie, you watch TVs, it actually slows down your brainwaves and puts you into essentially a hypnotic state where your brain and your body can't tell the difference between the movie and reality. And that's why when the thing jumps out at you in the movie, you get scared because your brain thinks it's actually in that scenario. Right? So what we're doing all day is playing movies in our head that our brain thinks are real. And if they're movies based on these lies and all of these stories that are, you know, that are natural occurrences based on like, you know, trauma and having crazy experiences in our life. And that's why we got to go in and redefine them, right? But if we're just continually telling this untrue story, we're then stuck in that scary movie vibe for our life. Because we keep telling the scary movie in our head.
Yeah, and you know what? Actually, this reminds me of a friend. I just went to lunch with her. We looked at her dating app. She's on Hinge. And there was a guy that like didn't respond to her after a while. And then he wrote back to her like 2 weeks later and was like, hey, you know, so sorry that I let it fall off for 2 weeks. Hopefully this isn't too late to respond. To be honest, I think I've had so many dating failures that I just like gave up. And I immediately read that And I thought, okay, this guy has had like a bad time. That's his story about dating, that dating has had a lot of failures and it sucks. My friend, and what has the behavior been because of that? That he doesn't respond because he thinks, what's the point? Dating sucks. It's not working. And then the result is my friend. She's sitting there reading this with me, and I looked at her and I thought, unmatch him. He seems so cynical. Like, why do you want to go out on a date with somebody like that? So he created his reality. Yeah. He held up the image of who he is in dating and how dating sucks for him. And it just literally blows my mind how these things work. So, Nathaniel, amazing. And I also know that your fourth topic was about conscious self-programming. So everybody listening, do a pattern interrupt, come up with something, whether it's waking up early, and then also catching up and completing things. So, as Nathaniel said, write a list of your whole life and every age, and write down an event that you remember from that age, whether it was traumatic or a pleasant experience. It's just something that really comes up in your memory, and really look out over it and see what you can complete and feel, what feelings you need to keep feeling, what memories you left unfinished. And then there's the context audit, which we've just talked about with your image, taking a look at who you are versus what's real in the world. And then this brings us to the conscious self-programming. So I could talk to you forever. You always have something new to say, but I'm curious, what does this mean to you? Because I know that we've been to many a seminar where people are like, you need to reprogram yourself. And I'm like, that sounds amazing. Tell me how. But what is your way, or what does this mean to you?
Yeah, it's I love this stuff. I'm so fascinated by it. For anyone really curious, there's a book called You Are the Placebo that I would recommend checking out. And it's just a really great gateway, really easy and compelling read, giving you an abundance of evidence of how much humans can change themselves just through their behaviors and their emotions and their thoughts. Like literally changing their DNA, changing the chemistry in their body, healing themselves of diseases, all kinds of crazy things. Like it's absolutely insane what we're actually capable of. And when it comes down to it, everything is programming you, right? The way you're sitting right now is training your body to be better at sitting that exact way. Right? Makes sense, right? And the way that you stand, that's why you build posture the way we have posture, and because it's just built out of habit, right? And then when you start to realize there's a lot of things in our life that get defined and set in place and become habits, that once you wake up and become aware enough, you realize I can actually decide how that's designed, right? Something as simple as a morning routine that if you don't have one developed, you just kind of maybe you're in college and you got to get up on time for class and you just do what you do. But if you actually stop and take 20 minutes and go, how could I make the 30 minutes I have from when I wake up between class, set me up for the best day ever? And you actually do something about that, which can be as simple as stretching for 5 minutes, drinking a big old glass of water, listening to your favorite music and writing down some gratitudes in your journal, something that simple. You start to now reprogram yourself and give yourself a new pattern to step into, essentially. So I've developed, and this is basically based off of lots of other methodologies and bodies of work, but something that's worked really well for me is understanding that there's certain windows of time, and it has to do with certain states of being and actual brainwave frequencies, where when you slow down enough and you're relaxed enough, you start to become more programmable. Essentially, your body's more available to receive. And that's why in hypnosis, you're ultimately relaxing someone to the point where they're super suggestible by the hypnotist. And part of this is essentially becoming your own hypnotist in a sense and telling yourself what's actually true, right? Because you're walking around all day telling this scary movie in your head about how nothing ever works out for you, even though if we actually looked, we could come up with thousands of things that have worked out for you in your life. Right. So sometimes you have to stop and be the hypnotist and literally kick your own butt with the truth. Right. And make it real. But what's super cool about it is you can actually get into this very calm, relaxed, meditative state where you're going over these different identity statements, which can just be I am statements or any sort of affirmations, any sort of declarations of actually defining what's true for you. And if you slow down enough and you really trust the process and understand the science, so checking out You Are the Placebo, Psycho-Cybernetics, these different books that I've mentioned, when you understand the science too, you're so much more compelled to really do the work because it's essentially undeniable. So conscious self-programming as a method itself is put in very simple steps is just slow down and relax, and then tell the truth about yourself and the context and the experience that you're in. Something as simple as reminding yourself that you have a 100% success rate of getting through bad days. Like, that's huge. And we walk around all day not being equipped with that truth and then thinking this one bad day is going to be the one that ruins them all, when you literally get through them every time. And sometimes you can cut that bad day in half, or even by 90% by just telling the truth about it, which is like, oh, wow, I'm feeling stressed right now. Okay, great. This has happened before. Okay, great. What should I do about it? Like, just even having, and that comes back to this lucidity thing. It's like you're waking up in the dream that is your stress and realizing there's other options. And it's easier and easier to be aware of all the options when you do this self-programming work and you build this unconscious context that you're living in. So it's this context of like, I'm someone who can always figure it out. I'm someone who trusts myself. I'm someone who takes care of myself. I'm someone who slows down enough where I can have this kind of awareness. And for me, the more I got really passionate and inspired to be that kind of person, where I'm able to get compliments, like you're saying from you, where it's like I bring relief and all these cool energies.
Yeah.
It all just kind of feels really full circle to me, and just really trying to be the best version of myself by making some really hardcore decisions about what that means and who I am, and then understanding how the human body and psychology actually works, and taking the time to train myself to become that person.
Do you know who I love is Benjamin Hardy from the book Willpower Doesn't Work. He's episode
yes.
1. Yes.
Your episode with him was amazing.
Yes, I really loved episode 1 with him. I had him on there because I thought it really set the tone for this podcast. And so those of you who are really interested in conscious reprogramming, I think that book is amazing. I also just want to note something really interesting from Joe Dispenza's book, You Are the Placebo, which is what Nathaniel just mentioned. I remember reading a passage in that book that talked about how 2 young girls, I believe in Georgia, they were able to, a tractor fell on their dad, and how the fuck that happens, I will never know. But it fell on their dad, and it was tons of weight that no 15-year-old girl could possibly lift, but they lifted the tractor off of him, and somehow he survived. This is a documented study, and it shows that the only justification that allowed for this to happen is that they didn't have time, or they didn't default into believing that they couldn't lift it.
Yeah, there was no other choice.
Yeah, there was no other choice, and that is something that Benjamin Hardy talks about in the book Willpower Doesn't Work.
And that's a great example, too, of context.
Yes.
So those girls live in an unconscious context with the story and the definition and the meaning that their father is the most important thing to them. So that's what gives them that automatic response to literally change their body and become superheroes and lift up the tractor, right? So when you do this, the pre-work, the training, you do the meditation, you take care of yourself, you slow down, you have vulnerable conversations, right? You do this integrative work. That's what sets you up to be the person who automatically snaps into the superhero, like those girls did. Because there was no other choice, because there's no other option, because their brain is literally wired to only define their dad as someone so worth saving that they do something impossible to save him.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that when you don't have time to go into your beliefs because you love something more than the image you hold for yourself, so they love their dad more than the belief or the commitment to their weakness, their strength of muscles.
Oh, so good.
So good. Okay, Nathaniel, before you go, last time I talked to Libby, and those of you, you've probably heard us mention Libby, that's Libby Crow, a.k.a. one of the best people in the world, both of our friends. She told me that you guys talked about the universe and why we're here, how we're here, the Big Bang. I want to know what the fuck your explanation is for everybody listening. Just give me something.
Okay. So I believe we live in an infinite universe, and that already makes it completely unexplainable, right? Because infinity means everything, which also means everything you can't even possibly consider that it means, right? So it gets a little wacky from the get-go.
I see what you just did there. I see what you did there.
But the fact that, we're even here, like if you actually stop, it's like, nobody fucking knows what's going on. Oh, pardon my French.
It's fine.
Nobody knows what's going on.
You've heard me talk like I'm a sailor on this podcast, but it's really just my personality coming out.
Yeah, you're so authentic.
Fucking authentic.
But infinity can't exist well, it can't. The only way infinity can exist is through these seeming finite forms, which is why it seems like we live in a finite universe, right? There's me, there's you, there's space, and then, it's not, and it's just made up of matter and da-da-da-da-da. And gosh, this is hard to explain in less than an hour. Long story short, infinite consciousness is the universe, and it designed this elaborate, beautiful journey so that it could experience itself in all these different ways. And the experience we're having right now is one of the most complex and the most beautiful movie that consciousness could possibly create. Because if you think about the third dimension, it's very, very fragile, right? I could get up from a chair wrong and fall over and die. That's how fragile it is, right? I could literally trip and just fall and be dead. Like, it's very, very fragile. So to be here is very, very special. And just the meaning in that, just the context of that is so special. And I think we're here to explore all that and to also experience all that there is to experience, which is why we're going through this cycle right now of literally finishing a whole cycle of experiencing war and tragedy and pain and suffering and all these crazy things. And we had to go through that in order to integrate that and complete those experiences and literally live in that higher baseline, that higher default as more conscious beings. And so I think we're literally just in the most beautiful film consciousness could possibly create. It's the most unconditionally loving thing it could do for itself, because it gives us all this, seeming free will. That's a whole other conversation, but it just gives us literally the most beautiful thing you could think of, right? Like there's rap music and cupcakes. Like,
yes, that's all I need.
Like, that's as good as it gets, right? Like, everyone gets to have their heaven on earth. So I think that's really special, and I think we are creating the most dynamic and incredible hero's journey for everyone, so that we actually experience it on the other side of that with all these things integrated.
Nathaniel, that was extraterrestrial. I just feel like everybody listening, it's like ET phone home right now. Like, what just happened? But it was so right.
You asked for it.
I asked and you delivered. Honestly, I'm so glad I did ask. And where can everybody find you? Because, I know you can't be friends with everyone. You're such a treat, but
I will literally try. I've been trying.
I believe it.
I'm so game.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think, my name, NathanielSolace.com, that'll get you to some places. And then just that name on Instagram or Facebook. Come say hi.
Thank you so much for being on the show with me, my friend.
Thank you, Ashley. It was so much fun.
Hey guys, it's Ash here, just reflecting on the episode with Nathaniel. So incredible. I really just love swimming in his energy. And one of the topics he brought up that felt really important for me was trauma. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about trauma is that when people hear that word, they think of some huge moment or event or something that's a really big deal. But what they're not thinking about is how trauma can typically be something that is very small that happens. It could be as small as somebody stealing a toy from you when you're 5, because the real trauma is not in what happens, but how you're thinking about it and the beliefs that you form because of it. And so that's why some of us have very odd memories that we keep remembering of something small that happened. And it's because a lot of the times we remembered something about it, or we decided it meant something inside of our heads that maybe it didn't mean, but that's how we stored it. And as a result, our body remembers that feeling. And the thing about trauma is that the body definitely remembers it. And when the body remembers it, it also will register experiences that feel like it. So if you, burnt your finger on a stove, maybe, you walk past the stove and you feel the heat, and your body immediately remembers that feeling of, shock or being caught off guard where you burnt your finger on a stove. And, it's like our body holds this trauma, holds this pain, holds these feelings. And it's,
our body's way of keeping us safe because it remembers how something felt in the past to prevent us from going through it again in the future. And while that can be very helpful, it also can really prevent us from moving forward in the way we want to in our lives. And that's why I wanted to use this post-episode conversation with you as an opportunity to just remind you that yes, trauma happens. And yes, sometimes it's a very big event, but also to remind you that a lot of trauma has happened and taken place in your life that likely wasn't a big to-do, wasn't like a huge explosion or a breakup or a parent leaving. A lot of the times the trauma in your life could genuinely look like a quick conversation where somebody said something and you made it mean something and you just couldn't seem to drop it. And there's some sort of trauma. Another area that I find really interesting is sexual trauma. So I think that one of the things that I've learned, through having so many friends who are therapists is that this is one of the deepest areas that people face trauma, and it's not really what you think. So when I think of the concept of sexual trauma, I think of somebody having to do something like by force. But what it also is when somebody bends what they're comfortable with to give to the other person, and then they're kind of traumatized by that. And maybe it shifts the relationship they have with their body, whatever have you. So, for example, let's say that you and your partner have sex in a different way. And maybe, your partner, doesn't want to wear protection or something like that. And maybe you decide that you're going to let that go and just hope that things work out. Well, maybe you will form some trauma through being afraid of getting pregnant or afraid of getting an STD. And you're always in this holding energy in between your sexual interactions, hoping that everything's okay. And that hope creates trauma because you sexually bent yourself to accommodate the other person beyond your comfort zone. That's a lot more of an aggressive form of trauma. So I think that these are just little thoughts that are coming up because God knows me and my girlfriends are talking personal development all the time. And somebody brought up, doing something sexually they didn't want to do. And we all had this whole conversation about sexual trauma. And this was what I took from it. I hope it's helpful for you. I hope that it helps you set your standards and honor them and stay where you're comfortable. And it doesn't mean that you need to live in your comfort zone because there's so much beyond it, but it does mean to honor yourself, respect yourself, know what you're capable of, and start to question the fundamental paradigm that society talks about and deems trauma as this huge, intense incident. It doesn't always have to be huge and intense as the sexual reference I had. It could be as small as some kid taking your toy and you at age 5 coming up with the belief that you don't get to keep anything or whatever it is. Trauma is much more nuanced. And one exercise I have for you is when your body is activated. So this happens. Maybe you're in a fight with a friend or a partner, or maybe your partner says something and your whole body's having a visceral response. Usually that visceral response is a reflection of some sort of trauma. And if you hold on to that visceral response your body's having, maybe when somebody says something in passing to you, and you start to get curious about it, start to think, what is a memory that you have that reminds you of this feeling? Trace this feeling back in time and remember a memory as early back in your life as you can that felt like that. And that is usually where you can start to get to the roots of some sort of trauma. And there's other steps you can take from there. You can look at the memory and think about what you believed about yourself, the other person, the situation, and you can start to notice how that's come into your life now. So these are just some thoughts to get you started with trauma. I thought this episode was incredible. If these mean something to you, if this is helpful to you, I can't tell you enough how helpful it is to me for you to give those written reviews on the iTunes, iPod, whatever app of our podcast app. God, I sound so crazy. Podcast app of your iPhone or whatever your smartphone is. There's a little written review section under all the episodes, and it's effortless. You don't even need to create a login, I don't believe. And it would mean so much to me. Thank you so much for listening. And I promise I won't have any trauma if you don't write me a review, but I would love it so much. All right. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and I can't wait to connect next week.
Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode of the U-Turn Podcast. We keep really detailed show notes at uturnpodcast.com. So if our guest mentioned a book or a resource that you're interested in, you'll be able to find that there. In the meantime, if you were inspired by this episode, if it made an impact in your life, we would be so grateful if you subscribed and posted a review for us on iTunes. Rumor has it on the street, the more reviews we get, the more subscribes we get, the more we can grow and get our impact out there in the world. In the meantime, I'd love to hear from you at Ashley Stahl on Instagram. I'm so grateful for connecting, and I look forward to next week's episode.